There was a time, a little over 2,000 years ago, when harming one of these animals could cost you your life. Not a lion, not a sacred cat, though the Egyptians loved those too. The animal I'm talking about is the earthworm, the same plain, soft brown worm you turn up with a fork on a spring morning and never think twice about. In the time of Cleopatra, the last pharaoh of Egypt, the earthworm was declared sacred. The story that's come down to us through the old farming and natural history writing is that she forbade anyone from removing worms from the soil of the Nile Valley, and that a farmer wasn't even permitted to touch one, for fear of offending the god who watched over the fertility of the land. Now, I'll be honest with you the way I'd want a man to be honest with me. Nobody has Cleopatra's decree written on a stone tablet. It's a story passed down, the way a lot of old farm knowledge is passed down, and I won't dress it up as more than it is. But here's what I find worth sitting with. Those people, farming that thin strip of black earth along the Nile, watched the river flood every single year and leave behind soil so rich it fed one of the greatest civilizations the world has ever seen. They didn't have microscopes. They didn't have soil labs. And they still looked at the humble earthworm and decided it was worth protecting by law. They'd noticed something. They'd watch the ground where the worms were thick, and they'd watch the ground where the worms were gone, and they knew which one grew the wheat. They were right. It took the modern world another 1,800 years and one very patient Englishman to prove exactly how right they were, and by the time he'd proven it, most of us had already forgotten it. That's what this is really about. Not Egypt. Your garden. The bed out back that used to grow tomatoes you were proud of, and now grows something smaller and paler every year, no matter what you feed it, because the odds are good that the thing your soil is starving for isn't in a bag at the garden center. It's the animal Cleopatra put under her protection, and it may have quietly disappeared from your ground while you were doing everything you were told to do. Let me tell you about the Englishman. Most people know Charles Darwin for one book, the one about finches and the origin of species, the one that started all the arguments. Almost nobody knows that the very last book he wrote, the one he finished 6 months before he died in 1882, wasn't about any of that. It was about worms. He'd been at it a long while. He read his first short paper on earthworms to the Geological Society in London back in 1837, when he was a young man, just home from his voyage. And he kept watching them, on and off, for the better part of 40 years, right up until the end of his life. The book has a title only a Victorian could love: The Formation of Vegetable Mold Through the Action of Worms. Vegetable mold was his word for what you and I would call topsoil, the dark, living, crumbly stuff at the top of good ground. And his argument, the one he spent 40 years building, was simple and at the time almost unbelievable. He said the topsoil itself, the very foundation the whole living world grows out of, is made largely by earthworms, passed through their bodies, ground fine, enriched, and laid back down on the surface, handful by handful, worm by worm, over ages of time. People thought he'd lost his way. A great man, they said, wasting his final years on worms. But here's the thing about that book. When it came out in 1881, it sold faster than On the Origin of Species had. 6,000 copies in the first year. The ordinary people, the gardeners and the farmers, they understood what the critics didn't. Darwin was telling them their soil was alive and that they'd been walking over the animal that made it their whole lives. And he didn't just claim it, he measured it. That's the part I want you to hold on to, because this is the fact you can carry out to the fence and tell your neighbor. Darwin set out to weigh the work of a worm. He had people collect a full year's worth of the little castings, the worm droppings you've seen on the surface of a lawn on a damp morning, from measured patches of ground. He weighed them dry, and from that he calculated that on good land, in a single year, earthworms bring somewhere between 10 and more than 15 tons of soil up to the surface on every single acre. 10 tons. Think about that the next time you strain to lift a single wheelbarrow. Underneath a quiet English meadow, without a sound, without a tool, an army of worms was moving 10 tons of earth a year and had been doing it since before the meadow had a name. He proved it another way too, and this one I love because it's the patience of the man showing through. He laid a flat stone on the ground in his garden at Down House and simply left it there. For years, decades. And he watched it sink. Not because it was heavy and pressing down, but because the worms underneath kept bringing soil up around it and casting it on top, so the ground slowly rose and swallowed the stone from below. That stone is still there. They call it the worm stone. He worked out that this same slow burial is why the great fallen stones at Stonehenge and old Roman floors and buried Roman villas sink so gently into the earth over the centuries. It isn't the earth pulling them down, it's the worms lifting the soil up over them. Aristotle, 2,000 years before Darwin, had already given them the finest name anybody's ever given them. He called earthworms the intestines of the earth. He understood that the ground digests, the way a body digests, and the worms are the gut that does it. The Egyptians protected them, the Greeks honored them, and the greatest naturalist of the modern age spent the last of his days on his knees in his own garden, proving they were right. So how did we forget? How did an animal that was sacred to a pharaoh and precious to Darwin end up as a thing we barely notice? Or worse, a thing we drive out of our own soil without meaning to? That's where this comes home to you and me. And I want to say something plainly before we go a step further, because I've made every one of these mistakes myself, and I don't want you carrying any guilt out of this. If your soil has gone quiet, if you dig down and don't find worms the way you used to, it is not because you're a poor gardener. It's because for 100 years, the mainstream advice, the books, the magazines, the fellow at the garden center told all of us to do 3 things that happen to be the 3 surest ways to empty your soil of worms. We did them faithfully. We did them because we were told they were good gardening. The fault is with the advice, not with you. The first thing they told us was to till. Turn the soil every spring, they said. Break it up, dig it over, run the tiller through it till it's fine and fluffy. And it looks like good work when you're done. I know it does. But a worm builds its whole life in a system of permanent burrows, some running deep straight down, a chimney it uses for years. When you drive a tiller through that top 8 or 10 inches, you don't just chop worms, though you do chop them. You destroy the burrows. You collapse the tunnels a worm spent months building. You tear open the cool, dark, structured world it lives in and leave it raw to the sun. A tilled bed turned every year is a bed a worm can never settle in. It's forever starting over in rubble. The second thing they told us was to keep the ground bare and clean, neat rows, bare soil between them, not a scrap of litter on top. It looks tidy. It looks like a garden that's cared for. But a worm will not come up to feed on a bare surface. It can't. Out in the open it dries out and dies, and the birds take it in seconds. Bare soil in the summer sun bakes to a heat that would kill any worm that dared come near the top. So when we kept our beds swept clean, we were telling the worms there was nothing to eat, and nowhere safe to eat it. They went deep, or they went away. The third thing was the bag of quick feed, the synthetic fertilizer, the fast blue crystals, the strong salts that green a plant up in a week. I used them for years, but most of those concentrated salt fertilizers are harsh on a worm's soft, moist skin. Pour enough of that through the ground, season after season, and you make the very soil the worm lives in a hostile place. You feed the plant directly and you starve and burn the animal that was meant to feed it. And once the worms are gone, the soil can't feed itself anymore, so you need more fertilizer and more. And the ground gets deader and hungrier the harder you work at it, till the burrows bare the surface, salt the ground. 3 honest habits, taught to all of us as good practice, and every one of them a quiet eviction notice served on the most valuable animal in the garden. Now, if you've ever pulled back an old board or a forgotten pile of leaves in a damp corner and found the soil underneath dark and crumbly and threaded through with worms, when the open bed 10 feet away was pale and hard, then you've already seen everything I'm about to tell you with your own eyes. You've run the experiment without knowing it. That corner is the whole secret. All we're going to do is make the whole garden into that corner. And here's where I'll ask you one thing, just once. If you've got worms in your soil, If you know that dark corner, do me a favor and stay with this channel. Because we don't just talk about what's wrong with a garden here. We fix it. That's what we do. There's a way to bring the worms back, and it costs nothing, and I'm going to give it to you now. 4 steps. Nothing to buy. Things most of us already have in the shed or the recycling bin. And by the end of one season, that quiet, tired bed can be alive again. But before the 4 steps, let me kill the one idea you're probably having right now, because it's the obvious answer and it's the wrong one. You're thinking, I'll just buy worms. There are folks who'll sell you a box of them in the mail, and I understand the appeal. But save your money. The worms you buy are almost always composting worms, red wigglers, bred to live in a rich manure pile, not the deep burrowing garden worms that build soil structure. Tip them into ordinary hard, dry garden ground, and most of them will crawl off or die because you've given them a house with no food in it. You cannot buy your way to living soil. You have to build the home. And the worms already in your ground and in your neighbors will find it. They always do. That's the whole trick. Don't import the animal. Build the conditions and let the animal come. Step 1. Cover the ground. This is the big one, the one that does most of the work. Go find plain brown cardboard, the corrugated kind from shipping boxes. Pull off the tape and any shiny printed labels. Lay it flat in sheets right over the tired bed, weeds and all, overlapping the edges by a good hand's width so no bare stripes show through. Then pile whatever you've got on top of it. Old leaves, straw, grass clippings, spent plants, wood chips. 4 inches of it, more if you have it. What you've just done is build a roof and a pantry in one motion. Underneath that cover, the ground stays cool and dark and damp all day, even in July. The worm can now come all the way to the top to feed in perfect safety day or night. And the cardboard and the leaves? That's the food. Worms love decaying cardboard. They'll come from feet away for it. Why it works is simple. You've turned a hostile bare surface into the exact conditions of that dark corner under the board. The one mistake to avoid: don't skimp on the overlap and don't leave gaps. A worm won't cross a hot bare patch to get from one covered spot to another. Cover it all. Step 2, never dig it again. This is the hardest one, because it goes against everything in our hands. We're gardeners. We like to turn the soil. It feels like work. It feels like care. But every time you dig, you knock the house down. So from now on this bed, you don't till and you don't turn. When you want to plant, you just pull back the mulch, make a small hole for your seedling, set it in, and tuck the mulch back around it. That's all. Leave the deep ground undisturbed so the worms can build those permanent burrows and keep them year after year. Why it works: an undug burrow is a highway. A worm can run the same deep tunnel for its whole life, dragging leaves down, bringing castings up, and every one of those tunnels is a channel that carries rain deep and lets air down to the roots. The mistake to avoid: don't undo your own patience. One spring of just turning it over quick, and you're back to square one. Trust the worms to do the digging. They're better at it, and they never ask for the weekend off. Step 3. Keep it damp, not wet. A worm breathes through its skin, and its skin has to stay moist or it can't breathe at all. In a dry spell, worms retreat far down and go still, and all their good work stops. So you keep that covered bed with the feel of a wrung-out sponge. Not soggy, never standing water, just evenly damp down through the top few inches. The beautiful part is that once your cover is thick, it does most of this for you. The mulch shades the ground and holds the moisture in so it can't bake away, which means you'll water far less than you ever did on bare soil, not more. Why it works: moist skin is a working worm, dry skin is a hiding one. The mistake to avoid: don't drown them trying to help. A bed that stays waterlogged drives worms out just as surely as a dry one because they can't get air. Damp, not wet. Your hand will tell you. Step 4. Feed the top and wait. This is where you learn the patience Darwin had. You don't dig anything in. You lay the food on top, the way the forest floor is fed, the way that flood laid silt on the Nile. Kitchen scraps tucked up under the mulch, more leaves in the fall, grass clippings through the summer. The worms come up under the cover at night, pull it down into their burrows, and turn it into castings, that dark, sweet-smelling, crumbly, worm-worked soil that Cleopatra's farmers and Darwin both understood was worth more than gold. Those castings are richer in the nitrogen, the phosphorus, and the potash your plants can actually use than the plain soil around them. It's the finest fertilizer on Earth, and the worms make it for free, right where the roots need it. Why it works. You're no longer feeding the plant and fighting the soil. You're feeding the soil and letting the soil feed the plant, the way it was always meant to go. The mistake to avoid: impatience. Don't go digging down after a month to see if it's working. Give it a season. Lay the cover in spring, and by fall, pull back a corner and look. I'll tell you what you'll find. You'll find that dark corner everywhere. You'll pull back the mulch, and the ground beneath will be soft where it was hard, dark where it was pale, and threaded through with worms and their tunnels and their castings. Ground you could push your whole hand into, that a year ago you could barely get a fork in. You didn't buy it. You didn't force it. You just stopped fighting the animal that builds soil and gave it a roof and a meal, and it did in one season what no bag of fertilizer could do in 10. And here's the thing I want to leave you with. The thing I think about when I'm out there in the evening looking at a bed I brought back this way. We didn't invent any of this. Cleopatra's people knew it 2,000 years ago, well enough to write it into law. Darwin proved it with a stone and a scale and 40 years of paying attention. The knowledge was never lost, really. It was just drowned out for about a century by people with something to sell us. And the worm never stopped doing its work. It's been down there the whole time, in the last wild corners of every garden, waiting for us to stop turning its house over and start covering it up instead, waiting, honestly, for us to remember. There's an old idea that a good gardener doesn't grow plants at all. A good gardener grows soil and lets the soil grow the plants. The worm figured that out before there were gardeners. Maybe the truest thing we can do at this point in our lives, with all the seasons we've got behind us, is get out of its way and let it teach us. It's a patient teacher. It's been at it a very long time, and it asks for nothing but a little cover, a little damp, and to be left alone to do the oldest work in the world. Your garden isn't starving for a product, it's starving for an animal, and that animal is probably closer than you think, waiting just under the last board in the last damp corner for an invitation home.